The iron shackles bit into her wrists, the metal cold against skin that had known too little kindness. Sarah stood on the auction platform, the rough wood beneath her bare feet worn smooth by countless others who had stood here before her. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the market square, and she could feel the weight of 100 stares examining her like she was nothing more than livestock. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd. Next item, young woman, approximately 20 years of age, starting bid at 50 silver. She kept her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere beyond the jeering faces, trying to disappear inside herself, the way she'd learned to do during the worst of her step-family's cruelty. The tattered servant's dress they'd left her in hung loose on her too thin frame, the fabric rough against her skin. She could smell the unwashed bodies of the crowd, hear their crude comments about her appearance, about what she might be good for. "Look at those ribs showing through," called someone from the back. "Hasn't been fed properly." "Too scrawny for field work," another voice added. "What's she good for?" The auctioneer cleared his throat. "She's house-trained, knows her letters. Previous owner vouches she's obedient." Previous owner, as if her stepmother had ever owned her, as if her father hadn't left her in that woman's care believing she would be loved. The memory of his funeral still ached in her chest. How quickly everything had changed after they'd lowered him into the ground. How quickly she'd gone from daughter to burden to servant to this. 40 silver, the auctioneer tried again, his voice slightly less confident. A merchant in fine clothes approached the platform, circling her slowly. She forced herself to remain still as his eyes catalogued every inch of her. The fading bruises on her arms, the scars on her hands from years of rough work, the way her collarbone jutted out too sharply. He lifted her chin with one finger, examined her teeth like she was a horse. "She's damaged goods," he pronounced, dropping his hand. "Look at those marks. Previous owner didn't take care of their property." Something sharp twisted in her stomach. Property. Is that all she was now? The merchant walked away without another glance. 30 silver, the auctioneer called, and she heard the first note of desperation creeping into his voice. Another potential buyer examined her, this one running rough hands over her arms, testing her muscle tone. "Too weak for heavy labour," he muttered. "And too spirited. Look at those eyes. She'd be nothing but trouble." He too walked away. 25 silver for a quick sale, the auctioneer tried. But the crowd was already losing interest, conversations turning to other matters, other lots. A few men made crude jokes about what she might be worth to them personally, but none stepped forward with coin. Each rejection felt like another stone added to the weight in her chest, another confirmation of what she'd always suspected about herself. "You deserve this," the voice in her head whispered, the same voice that had echoed her stepmother's words for years. "You're nothing special, nothing worth keeping. Father only loved you out of duty, and now even that's gone." 15 silver, the auctioneer called, his voice flat now. Surely someone can use a house servant. But the square was emptying, vendors packing up their wares, buyers moving on to more valuable prospects. She watched a beautiful girl her own age sell for 300 silver just 2 lots over. Watched the bidding war that erupted over her, the way men fought for the privilege of owning her. That would never be her. 10 silver, the auctioneer said quietly. 10 silver for quick removal. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the familiar numbness wash over her. This was what she was worth. 10 pieces of silver. Less than a decent horse, less than a set of kitchen knives. She'd known this moment would come eventually, known that her stepfamily's patience would run out, that they'd find a way to be rid of her permanently. A tear slipped down her cheek despite her efforts to hold it back. "No takers?" The auctioneer sounded tired now. "Very well, we'll mark this one unsellable and move on to—" The word hit her like a physical blow. Unsellable. Even at 10 silver pieces no one wanted her. She was worth less than nothing. She was a burden so complete that people wouldn't take her even at a loss. The crowd began to shift and murmur, their attention turning toward the platform again, but not for her. Something was happening behind them, some disturbance that was drawing every eye. She heard the sound of hoofbeats, the jingle of fine tack, the kind of horses that belonged to nobility. "Make way!" someone called from the back of the crowd. "Make way for His Majesty's party!" The word sent a ripple of shock through the square. Royalty didn't come to slave auctions. Kings had servants to handle such distasteful business, if they involved themselves in the trade at all. But the crowd was parting like water, people pressing themselves against the walls of the surrounding buildings, bowing their heads in deference. The very air seemed to change, becoming charged with something Sarah couldn't name. Her heart began to race for reasons she didn't understand. Through the gap in the crowd came the sound of boots on cobblestones, measured and confident. The murmur of voices died to absolute silence, the kind of hush that only came in the presence of true power. Sarah opened her eyes despite herself, despite knowing that whatever royal business was happening here had nothing to do with her. She was still nothing, still unsellable, still destined for whatever fate awaited those the market rejected. But something deep in her chest pulled tight, something that felt impossibly like recognition. The voice that cut through the silence was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, deep as thunder rolling across mountains, commanding as a force of nature itself. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through her bones and settling somewhere dangerous in her chest. "I'll take her." 3 words, simple words. But they fell across the market square like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through every person present. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her breath catching as she searched the crowd for the source of that impossible voice. The auctioneer stammered, his composure finally cracking completely. Your Majesty, I'm afraid there's been some mistake. This lot is—" "No mistake." The voice was closer now, and through the parted crowd came a figure that made Sarah's heart stop entirely. He was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered beneath a dark cloak that seemed to drink the morning light. His hair was black as midnight, his skin bronzed from sun and wind, and when his eyes found hers across the distance between them, she felt something inside her chest pull so tight she couldn't breathe. Those eyes, golden like honey in sunlight, ancient and knowing, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees go weak. He moved through the crowd like a wolf among sheep, people scrambling to get out of his way, bowing so low their foreheads nearly touched the ground. This was no mere noble. This was the Alpha King himself. "How much?" he asked, never taking his eyes from her face. The auctioneer's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Behind him the crowd pressed closer, straining to witness this impossibility. Their king, the most powerful shifter in the Northern Territories, showing interest in a girl they'd deemed worthless moments before. "Your Majesty," the auctioneer finally managed, "surely you cannot mean she is unmarked, unwanted, hardly suitable for—" "How much?" The words dropped like stones, each one edged with barely leashed power. The air itself seemed to thicken, and Sarah could swear she caught the scent of something wild and dangerous, pine forests and winter storms, and something purely, impossibly male. 10 silver, Your Majesty, but truly I must advise—" The Alpha King reached into his cloak and withdrew a leather pouch, heavy with coin. He threw it at the auctioneer's feet, where it landed with a sound like thunder. Gold pieces spilled across the platform, more gold than Sarah had ever seen in one place, more than had ever been spent on a single slave in the history of this market. The crowd gasped as one. "Keep the change," he said, his voice carrying a note of dark amusement. Then his attention returned to her, and suddenly there was nothing else in the world but those golden eyes and the way they seemed to see straight through to her soul. He stepped onto the platform with fluid grace, and Sarah's world narrowed to this, to his approach, to the way her body responded to his nearness with a warmth she didn't understand. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the rough wood beneath them. "What's your name?" he asked, and his voice, when directed only to her, was gentler, though no less commanding. "Sirrah," she whispered, her throat dry as sand. "Sarah?" He said it like he was tasting something precious. "I'm taking you away from here. You'll never stand on another auction block, never be sold or bartered or treated as less than you are." "What am I?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, desperate and raw. Something shifted in his expression, something that looked impossibly like wonder. "Everything," he said simply. "You're everything." The words hit her like a physical blow. Everything. She was nothing, had always been nothing, would always be. His hands moved to the shackles at her wrists, and she flinched instinctively. But his touch was impossibly gentle as he produced a key and freed her from the iron that had bitten into her skin. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. "You're mine now," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "No one will hurt you again. I give you my word." Mine. The word should have terrified her. She belonged to her step-family, been their property to dispose of as they wished. But when he said it, when it rumbled from his chest in that voice like distant thunder, it didn't sound like ownership. It sounded like protection. It sounded like home. The Alpha King shrugged out of his cloak, the fabric rich and warm and smelling of that same wild scent that seemed to cling to him. He wrapped it around her shoulders, and she had to bite back a sob at the simple kindness of it. The cloak was enormous on her small frame, but it blocked out the stares of the crowd, created a barrier between her and the world that had rejected her so thoroughly. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then come, we're leaving this place." He offered her his arm, and after a moment of hesitation she took it. His strength was immediately apparent, solid and reassuring beneath her trembling fingers. He led her down from the platform with careful deliberation, his pace measured to match her unsteady steps. The crowd parted before them like magic, every face turned down in deference. She caught whispers as they passed, incredulous murmurs about the king's choice, speculation about her identity, wonder about what he could possibly see in her. But for the first time in her life, the opinions of others seemed distant and unimportant. At the edge of the market square waited a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light. The horse was enormous, clearly bred for war, but when the Alpha King approached, it gentled immediately under his touch. "I've never ridden before," Sarah admitted quietly. He smiled at that, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "You'll ride with me. I won't let you fall." He mounted the stallion with fluid grace, then reached down to lift her up before him. His hands spanned her waist easily, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. She found herself settled against his chest, surrounded by his warmth and that intoxicating wild scent. "Hold on," he murmured against her ear, and she shivered at the closeness of him. She gripped the saddle horn with shaking hands as he gathered the reins. When the horse moved forward, she tensed, but his arm came around her waist, solid and reassuring. "I have you," he said simply. "I'll always have you." As they rode away from the market square, away from the place where she'd been deemed worthless and unwanted, Sarah allowed herself to believe that perhaps, impossibly, her life was about to change. She didn't understand why the most powerful man in the kingdom had chosen her, didn't know what he wanted from her or what he expected, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't afraid. The rhythm of the horse's gait gradually lulled Sarah into something that wasn't quite peace, but was closer to it than anything she'd felt in years. The Alpha King's arm remained steady around her waist, his chest solid against her back, and she found herself hyper-aware of every point where their bodies touched. His warmth seemed to seep through the borrowed cloak, chasing away a cold she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't natural. They'd been riding for perhaps an hour when he spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "You must be hungry." The statement was simple, matter of fact, but it hit her with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had noticed her hunger? Her step-family had fed her scraps when they remembered, kitchen leftovers when she was lucky. She'd grown so accustomed to the hollow ache in her stomach that she stopped noticing it herself. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the response trained into her by years of being told she was too much trouble, too demanding. "That's not what I asked." His tone was gentle but implacable. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" She couldn't remember. Days, perhaps, maybe longer. He made a sound low in his throat that might have been a growl, and she felt him shift behind her, reaching into his saddlebags. He produced a cloth bundle, unwrapping it to reveal bread and cheese and dried fruit, provisions that looked like feast food compared to what she was used to. "Eat," he commanded softly. She took the offered bread with trembling fingers, afraid to believe it was real. The first bite was heaven, rich and warm and substantial in a way that made her want to cry. She forced herself to eat slowly, to savour it, even though every instinct screamed at her to devour everything as quickly as possible before someone could take it away. "Better?" he asked when she'd finished half the bread. "Yes." The word came out rougher than she'd intended. "Thank you." "You don't thank someone for giving you what you need," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look back at him. "You especially don't thank me." "I don't understand." His golden eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in them. "You will." They rode in comfortable silence after that, the landscape gradually changing around them. The market town gave way to rolling hills, then denser forest. The trees here were ancient, their trunks thick enough that it would take several people holding hands to encircle them. Everything felt wild and untamed, like stepping into another world entirely. "What is this place?" she asked. "The border of my territory," he replied. "We're almost home." Home, such a simple word, but it sent an unexpected pang through her chest. She'd had a home once, before her father died, before everything changed. She'd thought she'd never have another. "Tell me about your father," he said suddenly, and she stiffened in his arms. "Why?" "Because someone should remember him properly, because his daughter deserves to speak of him without fear." The gentleness in his voice undid her. Before she could stop herself, the words were spilling out. How her father had been kind and loving, how he'd taught her to read and write, how he'd called her his little star, how everything had changed the moment they'd lowered him into the ground. "He would have hated what they did to you," the Alpha King said when she finished, his voice tight with controlled fury. "They said he left me to them, that it was his wish. Men like your father don't leave their daughters to wolves." His arm tightened around her slightly. "He would have fought for you if he'd known, would have died before letting them hurt you." The conviction in his voice made something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept carefully locked away. She wanted to believe him, wanted it so desperately it hurt. "How do you know?" she whispered. "Because that's what fathers do for their daughters, what men do for those they love." Those they love. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. The forest began to thin, and ahead of them Sarah could see open meadowland, and beyond that the most magnificent estate she'd ever laid eyes on. The main house was enormous, built of pale stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Gardens spread out in all directions, carefully maintained but with a wild edge that spoke of the forest's influence. Servants moved about the grounds, and she could see horses grazing in distant paddocks, everything speaking of wealth and power beyond her imagination. "This is your home?" she asked, awed despite herself. "Our home," he corrected quietly. As they approached the main gates, guards snapped to attention, bowing deeply as they passed. Sarah felt their curious stares and shrank deeper into the borrowed cloak. What must they think of their king bringing home a half-starved waif from a slave market? "Your Majesty," one of the guards called out as they passed, "shall I send word ahead?" "Tell them to prepare the Queen's chambers," the Alpha King replied without hesitation. Queen's chambers. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. You can't mean—" "Can't what?" His voice was amused now, warm with something that might have been affection. "I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I don't belong in Queen's chambers." The horse came to a stop in the circular drive before the main entrance, and suddenly he was dismounting, reaching up to lift her down. His hands spanned her waist again, and this time when he set her on the ground, he didn't immediately step away. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She raised her eyes to his, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Intensity, yes, but also tenderness and something that looked impossibly like wonder. "You are not nobody," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "You are not nothing. You are precious beyond measure, and I'll spend however long it takes convincing you of that." "But I don't understand why. What do you want from me?" "Everything," he said simply. "I want to give you everything you've been denied. I want to see you safe and fed and happy. I want to watch you remember how to smile." "I don't know how to be what you want me to be." "I don't want you to be anything other than exactly what you are." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I chose you, Sarah, not because of who I thought you could become, but because of who you already are." The great doors of the estate opened, and servants began to emerge, clearly alerted to their arrival. Sarah caught sight of fine livery, curious faces, and felt panic rise in her throat. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to live in a place like this." "Then I'll teach you," he said simply. "We'll learn together." An older woman approached them, her bearing suggesting she was the head housekeeper. She took one look at Sarah, at her tattered dress and too-thin frame and tangled hair, and her expression softened with immediate understanding. "Your Majesty," she said, curtsying deeply, "how may we serve?" "This is Sarah," he said, his hand moving to the small of her back in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. "She'll be staying in the Queen's chambers. See that she has everything she needs, clothes, food, a bath. Treat her as you would treat me." "Of course, Your Majesty." The woman turned to Sarah with a warm smile. "My lady, if you'll come with me." Sarah looked up at the Alpha King, sudden fear making her voice small. "You're not coming?" "I have matters to attend to, but I'll see you at dinner." His hand squeezed her shoulder gently. "Go, let them take care of you. You're safe here." Safe. Such a foreign concept. She nodded reluctantly and followed the housekeeper toward the grand entrance, looking back once to see him watching her with those golden eyes, an expression on his face she couldn't quite read. As they crossed the threshold into the most beautiful home she'd ever seen, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing into an entirely different life. The girl who had stood on that auction platform this morning felt like a stranger now, and she didn't know who she was supposed to be instead. But for the first time in years, she thought she might be willing to find out. The Queen's chambers were more beautiful than anything Sarah had ever imagined. Silk hangings in deep jewel tones adorned the walls, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a palace filled the spacious rooms. The four-poster bed was enormous, draped in fabrics so fine they seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. A fire crackled merrily in the marble hearth, and through tall windows she could see gardens that stretched to the horizon. It was perfect. It was terrifying. It was everything she didn't deserve. The bath the servants had drawn for her had been a revelation. Hot water scented with oils that smelled like spring flowers, soft towels that felt like clouds against her skin. They'd given her clothes finer than anything she'd ever touched, a gown of deep blue silk that fit her as if it had been made for her body alone. But as she sat at the dressing table, watching her reflection in the ornate mirror, all she could see was the same worthless girl who'd stood on that auction platform. The fine clothes couldn't hide the sharpness of her cheekbones, the way her collarbone jutted out too prominently, the fading bruises that spoke of years of rough treatment. A soft knock interrupted her spiralling thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting one of the servants. Instead, the Alpha King entered, and the sight of him made her breath catch. He'd changed from his travel clothes into formal attire, dark breeches and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, a midnight blue jacket that brought out the gold in his eyes. He looked every inch the king he was, powerful and commanding and completely out of her league. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice warm with appreciation. "I look like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's clothes," she replied honestly. He moved closer, his expression growing serious. "Is that what you think this is? Playing? I don't know what this is." The words burst out of her raw with confusion. "I don't understand why you chose me, why you brought me here, what you expect from me. I'm nobody, and this—" She gestured at the opulent room. "This isn't for people like me." "There are no people like you," he said simply. "There's only you, unique and precious and exactly where you belong." She wanted to believe him, wanted it with a desperation that frightened her, but before she could respond, another knock came at the door. "Enter," the Alpha King called. A servant appeared, bowing deeply. "Your Majesty, dinner is ready. The court is assembled and waiting." The court. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. I can't meet them." "You can," he said gently. "I'll be right beside you." "They'll know," she whispered. "They'll see what I am, where I came from. They'll wonder why their king brought home a slave." His expression darkened, something dangerous flickering in those golden eyes. "Anyone who questions my choices will answer to me personally. You are my choice, Sarah, my queen. They will respect that or face the consequences." The formal dining hall was magnificent, a long table set with crystal and silver that sparkled in the light of massive chandeliers. Nobles filled the chairs, men and women dressed in the finest clothes, their jewellery catching the light like captured stars. As Sarah entered on the Alpha King's arm, every conversation died. The silence stretched, heavy with speculation and thinly veiled curiosity. She could feel their stares like physical weight, cataloguing her appearance, her nervousness, her obvious lack of noble bearing. Whispers began to ripple through the room, too quiet for her to make out words, but loud enough for the intent to be clear. Who is she? Where did she come from? What could the king possibly see in her? "Breathe," the Alpha King murmured in her ear, his hand steady at her back. "You have every right to be here." He seated her at his right hand, the place of honour traditionally reserved for the Queen. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, least of all the woman seated across from her, a stunning brunette with cruel eyes and perfect posture, who looked at Sarah like she was something distasteful that had been tracked in on someone's shoe. "Your Majesty," the woman said, her voice honey-sweet with underlying venom. "What a surprise to see you've returned with a guest. Won't you introduce us to your companion?" The pause before the last word was deliberate, calculated to wound. "This is Sarah," the Alpha King replied, his voice carrying a warning that made several people shift uncomfortably. "She is my chosen mate and your future queen. You will treat her with the respect due her station." Chosen mate, future queen. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. This was moving too fast, too impossibly fast. She wasn't ready for this, would never be ready for this. "How wonderful," the brunette continued, her smile sharp as a blade. "And where might your family be from, my lady? I'm not familiar with your house." "I don't have a house," Sarah said quietly, honesty compelled from her by sheer terror. "Ah." The woman's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. A commoner, then. How democratic of His Majesty. Other conversations around the table had stopped entirely now, everyone leaning in to catch this exchange. Sarah felt heat climb her cheeks, felt the familiar shame settling over her like a familiar cloak. "Lady Helena," the Alpha King's voice cut across the table like a whip. Perhaps you'd like to explain to the table why you think birth matters more than worth? Of course not, Your Majesty. Lady Helena backtracked quickly, but her eyes remained fixed on Sarah with predatory interest. I simply meant... What you meant was to make my chosen feel unwelcome in her own home. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I trust that won't happen again. But the damage was done. Sarah could feel the weight of every stare, could hear the whispered conversations that resumed around them. Commoner, nobody. What does he see in her? She's nothing special. He'll tire of her soon enough. The meal passed in a blur of courses she couldn't taste and conversations she couldn't follow. Every laugh felt directed at her. Every sideways glance felt like judgment. By the time the final course was cleared away, she felt raw and exposed like an open wound. "If you'll excuse me," she said quietly, standing from the table. "I'm rather tired." She didn't wait for permission, simply fled the dining hall with as much dignity as she could muster. Behind her, she heard the Alpha King call her name, but she didn't stop. She couldn't face his kindness right now, couldn't bear to see disappointment in those golden eyes. She made it to the gardens before the tears started, great gasping sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her chest. Lady Helena had been right. She didn't belong here. She was a commoner, a nobody, a former slave with no family and no prospects. What had she been thinking? The sound of footsteps on gravel made her spin around, expecting to see the Alpha King come to tell her he'd made a mistake. Instead, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man she didn't recognize, tall and lean with cold eyes and a cruel smile. "Well, well," he said, his voice cultured and smooth. "The king's little pet, all alone in the dark, how convenient." Fear shot through her, primal and immediate. "Who are you?" "Someone who's very interested in you, my dear." He stepped closer, and she could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. "You see, our dear king has made himself vulnerable by choosing you, a weakness we can exploit." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. You're nobody, nothing, a pretty little distraction that's made him forget his duty to his people." The man's smile widened. "But don't worry, we're going to help you disappear, permanently." The attack came without warning. Strong hands seized her arms, dragging her toward the tree line. She opened her mouth to scream, but a cloth was pressed over her face, something chemical and cloying that made her vision blur. As consciousness faded, she heard the man's voice, distant and distorted. "The king will learn the price of putting sentiment before strength, and you, little pet, will be the lesson." Darkness claimed her, and her last thought was that perhaps this was for the best. Perhaps everyone would be better off if she simply disappeared. Sarah woke to the taste of copper in her mouth and the bite of rough rope against her wrists. The world swam into focus slowly, a crude stone chamber lit by flickering torches, the smell of damp earth and something else, something that made her wolf sense she didn't know she possessed recoil in terror. Rogues. She could smell them now, wild and wrong, shifters who had turned their backs on pack law and civilization. The scent was corruption made manifest, and it clung to everything in this place. "Ah, the little queen awakens." The voice belonged to the man from the garden, but now he stood in his true form, scarred and wild-eyed, with the lean hunger of a predator who had forgotten what it meant to be human. "Welcome to your new home, pet." She tested the bonds at her wrists, but they held firm. Her head still swam from whatever they'd used to drug her, making it hard to focus, hard to think clearly. "What do you want?" she managed. "What we want is to remind your precious king that sentiment is weakness." He circled her slowly, like a wolf stalking wounded prey. "He's grown soft, choosing a nobody like you over strategic alliances. The Northern Pack deserves a strong leader, not one who lets his heart rule his head." "So you're going to kill me to prove a point?" "Oh, we're going to do much more than that." His smile was all teeth and malice. "We're going to make him watch, going to make him choose between his crown and his precious little mate. And when he chooses duty, as he must, you'll learn exactly how much you're really worth." The words hit their mark, finding the tender places in her soul where doubt lived. Maybe he was right. Maybe the Alpha King would realize she wasn't worth a war, wasn't worth risking his people for. Maybe. The sound of howling cut through the stone walls, distant but growing closer. Wild, primal, and filled with a fury that made her captors freeze. "Oh, impossible!" the rogue leader breathed. "The wards should have hidden us." But Sarah knew better. She could feel it now, that golden thread that had been pulling tight in her chest since the moment she'd first seen him. The mate bond. It didn't care about wards or magic or distance. It was primal, inevitable, and right now it was leading him straight to her. The howling came again, closer now, and with it the sound of running feet, shouted orders, the clash of battle beginning somewhere above them. Her captor's face went pale with the realization that he'd made a fatal mistake. "You didn't count on the bond," Sarah said, and for the first time since waking she smiled. "You thought he'd have to search for me. You thought I was just some human girl he'd taken a fancy to." "Shut up," the rogue snarled, but there was fear in his eyes now. "I'm his mate," she continued, the truth of it settling into her bones, like coming home. "His chosen. And he's coming for me." The door to the chamber exploded inward in a shower of splinters and stone. Through the gap came a figure that barely looked human, 7 feet of pure fury and muscle, eyes blazing gold with wolf fire, claws extended and ready to kill. The Alpha King in his rage was a force of nature, terrible and beautiful and completely unstoppable. "Get away from her," he commanded, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The rogue leader tried to run. He made it 3 steps before the Alpha King was on him, moving with impossible speed. There was no finesse to the fight, no artistry, just brutal, efficient violence that ended with the rogue's neck snapping like kindling. "You came," Sarah whispered, as he knelt to cut her bonds, his hands gentle despite the fury still burning in his eyes. "Did you think I wouldn't?" He gathered her into his arms, and she felt the tremor that ran through his powerful frame. "I felt your fear, felt your pain. Nothing could have stopped me from coming. I thought, when they said I was your weakness, that I made you vulnerable. I thought maybe they were right." His hands cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You want to know what makes a king weak? Ruling without love, leading without something worth protecting. You don't make me vulnerable, Sarah. You make me invincible." The sound of fighting echoed from above them, but it was growing distant, the outcome no longer in doubt. "My men are finishing with the rest," he said grimly, "but we need to get you out of here." As he carried her from that terrible place, Sarah caught glimpses of the battle's aftermath, rogue bodies littering the ground, his warriors standing victorious, the entire structure of the enemy's hiding place reduced to rubble. All of this destruction, all of this violence because someone had dared to touch what was his. "You came with your whole pack," she realized. "I came with everyone who follows me," he corrected. "Every warrior, every ally, every soul who calls me king. They came because I asked them to. Because you are their queen, whether you believe it yet or not." They emerged into the night air, and waiting for them was indeed an army. Hundreds of shifters in both human and wolf form, all of them focused on their king and the woman in his arms. As they appeared, a cheer went up from the assembled pack, a sound of joy and victory that echoed across the forest. "They're celebrating," she said wonderingly. "They're celebrating their queen's safe return." He set her on her feet, but kept his arms around her, and she was grateful for the support. Her legs felt unsteady, whether from the drugs or the emotional whiplash of the evening's events. "I need to say something," he announced to the assembled pack, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. Tonight, enemies of our pack attempted to use my mate against me. They believed her to be a weakness, a vulnerability they could exploit. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, sounds of anger and disgust. They were wrong. His voice grew stronger, more commanding. This woman is not my weakness. She is my strength, my heart, my chosen mate and your queen. He turned to face her then, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Love, yes, but also reverence, wonder, absolute certainty. "Sirrah," he said, his voice softer now but no less intense, "I claim you before my pack, before the moon herself. You are mine as I am yours, my mate, my queen, my equal in all things." Before she could respond, he was kissing her, and the world exploded into sensation. The mate bond that had been pulling tight in her chest suddenly snapped into perfect alignment, connecting them in a way that went beyond physical, beyond emotional, into something that touched the very essence of who they were. When they broke apart, she was breathless, overwhelmed, but for the first time in her life she felt complete. "I claim you too," she whispered, the words coming from some deep place of instinct she didn't know she possessed. "My king, my mate, my heart." The pack erupted in celebration, howls rising to the night sky in a symphony of joy and acceptance. But all Sarah could focus on was the man holding her, the impossible love shining in his golden eyes, and the truth that had finally settled into her bones. She was precious. She was chosen. She was home. 3 months later, Sarah stood before the mirror in what had truly become her chambers, adjusting the delicate silver crown that rested on her dark hair. The reflection looking back at her was almost unrecognisable from the girl who had stood on that auction platform. Her cheeks had filled out, her skin glowed with health, and her eyes held a confidence that had been born from love and nurturing. Today was the formal coronation, the ceremony that would make official what everyone already knew in their hearts. She was their queen, chosen and beloved, and the thought no longer filled her with terror. A soft knock came at the door, followed by the familiar voice of Elena, the head housekeeper who had become something like a mother to her. "Your Majesty, it's time." "I'll be right there," Sarah called back, taking one last look at herself. The gown was magnificent, deep blue silk that brought out her eyes, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like starfire. But more than the dress, more than the crown, it was the certainty in her expression that marked her transformation. She was precious, she was chosen, she belonged here. The great hall was packed with members of the pack, nobles and common folk alike, all gathered to witness the ceremony that would formalise what their hearts already knew. As the massive doors opened and she stepped into the hall, a hush fell over the assembly. But she had eyes only for the man waiting at the altar, her mate, her king, her heart. He wore formal robes of midnight blue, the crown of the northern pack catching the light from the massive chandeliers overhead. When their eyes met across the distance, his face transformed with a smile so radiant it made her breath catch. She walked down the aisle with sure steps, no longer the uncertain girl who had fled from dinner parties and hidden from curious stares. Every face she passed showed love, respect, acceptance. These were her people now, and they were hers. When she reached the altar, he took her hands in his, and the familiar spark of the mate bond made her smile. "Ready?" he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "I've been ready since the moment you said I was everything," she replied. The ceremony was beautiful, ancient words spoken in the old tongue that bound her not just to him but to the pack itself. When the high priest placed the queen's crown upon her head and declared her their rightful ruler, the cheer that went up shook the very foundations of the great hall. But it was the moment afterward, when they were finally alone in their private chambers, that meant the most to her. "How do you feel, my queen?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "Like I'm exactly where I belong," she said honestly. "Like everything that happened to me before led me here, to this moment, to you." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, like she was something precious beyond measure. "I have something for you," he said when they broke apart. From his pocket he withdrew a small wooden box worn smooth with age. Inside, nestled in silk, was a simple silver locket. "It was my mother's," he explained, as he fastened it around her neck. "She told me to give it to the woman who would be my true mate, my equal in all things." Sarah opened the locket with trembling fingers to find a tiny portrait inside, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "She's beautiful. She would have loved you," he said with certainty, "would have seen what I saw from the moment I laid eyes on you on that platform." "What did you see?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer now. "Home," he said simply. "I saw my home." Over the weeks that followed, Sarah threw herself into her role as queen with a passion that surprised everyone, including herself. She established programs for orphaned children, remembering too well what it felt like to be alone and unwanted. She worked with the pack's healers to ensure no one went hungry, knowing the hollow ache of an empty belly. She visited the border territories, bringing the Crown's protection to those who lived on the margins. And always, always, she remembered the girl she had been, broken and beaten down, but somehow still breathing, still hoping. She used that memory not as a source of shame, but as a wellspring of compassion. "You've become everything I knew you could be," her mate told her one evening as they walked through their gardens. "Everything I saw in you from the beginning." "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real," she admitted. "Sometimes I wake up expecting to be back in that servant's room, or worse, back on that platform." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "Do you want to know a secret?" She nodded. "That first night, when I brought you home, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking on you, afraid you would disappear, afraid I would wake up and find out you were just a dream. You were afraid I would leave. I was afraid I wasn't worthy of you," he said, and the admission made her heart ache with love. "You've been through so much pain, survived so much cruelty, and yet your heart remained soft. You could have been bitter, could have let them break you, but instead you chose kindness. How could I ever be worthy of that?" "The same way I'm worthy of your love," she said, finally understanding the truth that had taken her months to accept. "Not because we've earned it, but because it's ours, because we choose each other every day." That night, as they lay in their bed with moonlight streaming through the windows, Sarah traced patterns on his chest and thought about the journey that had brought her here. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to that auction?" she asked. "No," he said without hesitation, "because I was always going to come. The moon herself couldn't have kept me away from you." "How do you know?" "Because you're written in my stars, carved into my soul. I would have found you anywhere, any time. If not that day, then another. If not that life, then the next." She lifted her head to look at him, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll never let me forget the girl I used to be. Not because I want to live in the past, but because I want to remember how far we've come. I want to remember her courage, her hope, her stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless." "I promise," he said solemnly, "and I promise to love every version of you, the girl you were, the woman you are, and the queen you're becoming." As sleep took her that night, surrounded by warmth and love and absolute safety, Sarah thought about that broken girl on the auction platform. She wanted to reach back through time and tell her what was coming, that the pain would end, that love was real, that sometimes fairy tales did come true. But mostly she wanted to tell her that she was already precious, already worthy, already everything she needed to be. She just had to wait for the right person to see it.